Lara, it's so good to have you with us. Thank you so much for taking the time. And we would just like to start with your own story. How did you first get involved in the field of counter-extremism?
Well, first off, thank you very much for having me here today. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. So, my story begins many, many years ago. I joined the FBI in 1999 and was assigned to the FBI Dallas Division, and very quickly was given assignments on the Counterterrorism Squad, where I almost immediately began working Hamas related matters. I was working counterterrorism on the morning of 9/11. I watched the second plane fly through the towers on my supervisor's television. And it was really at that moment that my dedication to the countering terrorism, countering extremism mission was solidified in my own mind. So I spent the next 22 some odd years working counterterrorism with the FBI in various capacities, working all forms of international terrorism from Hamas to Hezbollah, ISIS, Al Qaeda, etc., and then retired in April of 2023 when I went out and began to work in the cybersecurity realm for a minute. And then October 7th happened. And when I woke to the news of the terrible terrorist attack, it really um, affected me because I realized that this was something different, but it was also something that, we should have foreseen. And when I say we, I mean government, society, everyone. And then almost immediately, when I began watching the American media coverage of it, the coverage was of individuals and entities who were praising these murders and the rapes and the tortures. And I recognized individuals and elements that were driving some of that activity and understood that those individuals, some of those individuals and groups, really the ones behind it, were extremists and were intentionally driving a pro-terror agenda. And I felt compelled to do something to help in this arena. And I didn't feel that I could do that working in cybersecurity. So I reconnected with an associate of mine who is the director of the George Washington University's program on extremism. He actually founded the program a decade ago. And he and I began to collaborate. And very soon I joined him as his head of terrorism research. And that was in May of last year. And have been working all forms of extremism since then, but with a particular focus on Hamas and Islamism and how those ideologies are permeating United States society today.
Whoa. There's so many intersections there. And it's interesting. So my personal story, my father-in-law was actually in the second building in 9/11. He died. He was a victim of 9/11. Um,
Mhm.
so this is very close to my heart. And what got me specifically interested in, I mean, growing up in Israel, and that got me interested in understanding terrorism and what drives them and the effect they have on the victims as well. But to hear you saying that you saw that, what's been happening after October 7th, that's brilliant because I did not know. Like I what Susie calls an October 8th person, where all of a sudden everything kind of came to light. Um, but you recognized it.
Yes, I did. And really, it made me feel sick and guilty. And not because, when I was an FBI agent working these very matters decades ago, we didn't try our hardest. But I do feel like that a number of the, elements, and I'm sure we'll get to this, of the original Hamas infrastructure here, whose goal was to spread hate and advocate for violence, were left undeterred and in fact operated, basically without any interference for decades leading into October 7th. And that that ignorance basically of our government and society and as a whole as to what was going on, really we were sleeping. And when we woke up on October 8th, it was very unfortunate to find where we were.
Wow. This is all so fascinating because, as Mary said, I'm more of an October 8th Jewish activist. I always identified with being a Jew, but I was never, an activist for my own community. Um, and I, teach at a university. So starting with October 8th, the people who I stood with through all the years as an activist were not standing with me. And I was like so confused and not understanding. And I'm really interested to learn more about, because obviously it was existing. And from your experience, when did anti-Semitism begin to intersect with campus radicalization in a way that felt coordinated? Because it sounds like from what you were saying, it's been coordinated for years and years.
Yes, and if you will allow me, I need to go back several decades, right? This has been a very slow evolution over 30 years. While these groups have gradually gained momentum and audiences. So let's go back to the beginning because I think it's necessary. A lot of people woke up on October 8th and thought that all of this began there, and that is not true. So Hamas and its parent organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, they began their journey here in the United States, interestingly, on US campuses throughout the country in Muslim student unions. That is where they first began. That was in the 1960s. And for decades, their narratives and agendas and ideologies, which, by the way, have always been anti democratic, anti West, and anti Semitic, they were secluded pretty much in those years to their inner circles, right? They could freely speak about their agendas and their beliefs and their ideologies and their goals, but they were only to small groups. And that's what I would call the formative stage of what we're seeing today, when they were quietly building their infrastructure. And by the 1980s, that infrastructure included not just student groups, but cultural groups and front organizations and a defined hierarchical structure with a Shura Council, which is like a board of directors, and then a chairman of the board that went by another name, but we won't go into that. And that's important because by the late 1980s, when Hamas was created by the Muslim Brotherhood, these guys, the Islamists here, were well founded. And so even after Hamas was created and the three front organizations were created here in the United States to support Hamas with media, money, and men, that is a fact that has been tried in federal court, and the evidence has been reviewed by the Supreme Court. There were three original front organizations, and they were to support Hamas with media, money, and men, arguably with propaganda being the most important piece of that, right? They did that in the first intifada between the late 80s and 1993, again, very openly, but within their own groups, right? They understood that their narratives, their agendas, and their goals would have been not tolerated in US society at that point. And a key event occurred in 1993. In 1993, the Oslo Accords were signed. And Hamas as an organization immediately came out and opposed those. And the question is why? They opposed them because the Palestinian Authority and Yasser Arafat were leading the Palestinian narrative, and Hamas wanted to gain control. They wanted to undermine the authority. They opposed peace at all costs. It was very clear. And, that is a topic for another day. But why am I talking about it here? Because the US based Hamas infrastructure, upon the signing of Oslo, held a 3-day meeting in the United States that was wiretapped by the FBI, where they actually planned, in their own words, how they were going to operate here in the United States. They were going to defeat the peace accords. They were going to support jihad. They supported the annihilation of Israel. But more importantly, they understood that they would be exposed as being barbaric and extremists if they didn't modify their methods of operation. And so they decided that they needed to begin normalizing their narrative of hate and violence to US society, but they needed to couch it in terms that American society would understand, because American society would never understand at that point, right? Advocating for killing Jewish people or the annihilation of the country of Israel, right? And so how did they plan to do that in this wiretap meeting? By infiltrating media, politics, and universities. They actually named those three realms as key to beginning to normalize their narrative, which again is hate and violence, anti-Semitism. And they talked at length about how they were going to do that. how they were going to identify professors that they could institute into universities to teach their version of history, to teach their ideology in a subtle manner so that they could slowly, and again, this is 1993, right? So how many decades ago is this? Begin to normalize that narrative while lying to the American public about their agenda. And they said, we'll talk about our cause and we'll pretend like it's a humanitarian issue or a civil rights issue or a charitable issue because the Americans will understand that, right? And so they began very slowly normalizing that narrative throughout media, politics, and universities. And even as they planned in that meeting, by cleansing curriculum in K through 12 schools to ensure that their narratives were fed to children who had no choice but to listen. And so now here we are 30 years later, and they can now openly advocate for support for Hamas and other terrorist groups and regimes. They can even advocate for the killing of innocent civilians on October 7th. And that message is not only acceptable in our society, but it's almost, to me, the loudest message that we hear. So what was once unacceptable to voice outside of closed doors because of their strategic agenda is now being shouted loudly from campuses across the country.
I feel like I need to breathe. When I first heard about that, I remember, and I watched it in the documentary October 8th. Lorenzo was talking about it. And I had this visceral reaction of rage and sadness and fear. I was scared to my core because, like you're describing, they were in it for the long game. And we didn't know. I didn't know. My friends didn't know. I remember, my husband was watching October 8 with me, and we were just looking at each other like, what is happening and what can we do now to protect our kids? I mean, we have kids in K to 12, and I'm dealing with Massachusetts Teacher Associate Union over here, where the MTA has been showing the same materials that, like the ones you're mentioning, that are just radicalized under the frame of social justice.
Yes.
There's a part of me that, like, even hearing you sharing all of that history, that feels hopeless. But then me being me, like, I'm a forever optimistic, so I feel like we have to do something when we have to fight. How do how do we get it out there to the public? Like, my thought is like, oh my God, everybody was duped. I want every single person in America and the world to know what you just shared with us, because this is not common knowledge.
It's not. And the unfortunate part about this is that we are 20 years behind in this battle of information, right? And that's really what it is. It's an information war, with one side really focusing on, manipulating facts and events to serve their purpose. Hamas are master strategists with that. The Muslim Brotherhood, they're master strategists. They can take pretty much any event and turn it into something that it's not, and then package it in a way that, Western society somehow feels aligned with it. I think there is hope, but it begins with raising our voices. It begins with education, because, a lot of what's going on involves falsities and things that aren't true. And I think that I have faith that in our society, if we tell the truth that's backed by substantiated evidence, that we can begin to educate, the law enforcement, campus officials, and the general public as to what the reality is. There are challenges with that. The challenges are, one, in Western society, we really have a hard time understanding a movement that plans 100 years in advance. In Western society, we plan lunch, we plan spring break. If we're in politics, we might plan 2 to 4 years in advance. We don't plan 100 years in advance. And if we have a plan and someone gets injured or someone gets arrested, we stop and we come up with a better plan and figure out that what we were doing was probably wrong. With this ideology, there is no deterrent. And when you're trying to convey the truth to Western society, it's very hard for us to get our minds around that. Why would anyone want to sacrifice life for an agenda that they may never see in their lifetime? It's a very hard concept to get around. And then, in our society today, and I'm sure we'll get into, all things social media, but in our society today, there are so many conspiracy theories that fly around that have no basis in fact or reality, that when you come out and you attempt to tell the truth about a conspiracy that's been going on for 30 years, people look at you like, oh, well, that's just another conspiracy theory. That's why it is important to bring facts, to bring the statements of the bad guys, to bring the documents of the bad guys, to bring that, because otherwise, it's just another theory. But this is not a conspiracy theory. This is a conspiracy, by the way, which has been tried in federal courts in multiple jurisdictions, and juries have found that this evidence is legitimate and that these front organizations were created to support Hamas. And so this is not something that's being fabricated. It is real, but we are fighting an uphill battle, and we're about 20 years behind the other side.
Oh my gosh. I have so many thoughts of rage and frustration and sadness. And then I guess my question after hearing this is, so, okay, just for context, before October 7th, I was part of the ADEI committee. And then when I realized on October 8th that Jewish life and anti-Semitism, we weren't included, I was like, wait, where's the critical thinking? How did my colleagues and students become radicalized? People with PhDs who are getting masters, who have bachelor degrees. I mean, how did this happen strategically on campuses that they were able to drink the Kool-Aid and not even question?
I think there are a number of factors that play into it. And it begins with you're dealing with an adversary that is extremely strategic, very smart. And they recognize that they need to package their narratives in terms that people can relate to. And so if you're talking about on campuses, so why are, really intelligent students at the best schools in the United States, why would they be susceptible to radical ideologies? And we'll get to the professors and everything as well, but let's talk about the students. And it's actually the characteristics, in my opinion, this is not fact, this is opinion. I talk about fact and opinion, that the characteristics of student populations that make them so brilliant and wonderful are also the characteristics that groups like Hamas and even the terrorist regime of Iran seek to manipulate. And what are those, right? You go off to college, one, searching for an identity. You're trying to find out who you are, where your place is in the world. And when the narrative is put to you by evil actors like Hamas and Iran, do you want to be good or bad? Well, the answer is I want to be good, typically. Most aspiring students and young leaders want to be good. Well, they're being fed a narrative that there is only one good side, and that good side embraces hate and that violence is the answer, but they're putting it in terms, like genocide. Oh, are you pro-genocide or anti-genocide? Well, that takes out of the equation the question, is there genocide? Is the country of Israel committing genocide? The answer is no, they are not. There's only one party to that conflict, and that's the terrorists that are attempting to annihilate an entire population based on what they look like, who they worship, or where they come from, right? But that's not the question. The question posed to these students is, are you for genocide or are you against it? Well, my answer is I'm against genocide. I don't want to see genocide. And so you find these students having to choose between one of two, and they go with, oh, clearly I'm anti-genocide. Well, now you're in the segment of the population that's preaching hate and violence and all of that. The second characteristic, I think, that makes students wonderful, but then also, susceptible to being incidentally radicalized, is students' desire to align with movements that represent change in the world and represent good. Like, let's help oppressed people, especially if you're dealing with, upper class individuals who've not been oppressed. They want to help the oppressed people in general. And what Hamas and Iran and those groups are telling these students is, you are oppressed. The United States oppresses you. Western democracy oppresses you. Governments like Iran are the saviors. Hamas is the saviors. When let's unpack that. If the students actually thought about it or knew the true reality, what is an oppressor? An oppressor is a government who will shoot a woman in the head for not wearing her hijab correctly. That's oppression, as opposed to being in the country where you have all of these constitutional rights and you may be disgruntled or unhappy or not have as much money as you want. It's a different form of oppression than being killed because you don't wear your clothes the right way. Or, when you're talking about Hamas, they align with movements that are, um, minority movements, that if those minority movements were under Hamas's control, Hamas would immediately kill them because they don't believe in, their version of radicalized Islam. And so, but they're not telling them that. They're saying, you're oppressed, we're oppressed, come help us. We're oppressed. And students want to change things for good. And then thirdly, I think what makes student populations amazing but susceptible is, and I don't know if you have children, but I have teenagers, and I remember how I was in college, is the confidence of the youth in their own ability to think and make decisions because they believe they know it all. And for those of us who are older, we know that the older that we get, the more we realize that the less we know and the less we thought we knew, right? But when you're in college, oftentimes you think that you have all the answers. And so without a firm understanding of any conflict or the groups or the problems or the facts or what's actually going on, they make decisions because they feel like that they don't need to inquire, that they already have the answers. So I'll stop there, but I know that was a lot.
No, it's so good because, first of all, it's they're so brilliant. Like Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood, they're brilliant, which I hate to admit that. My second thought was going back to your point about education, we need to start younger. Because when they get to college, they already have like their mindset. I mean, this is probably for most of them the first time out of their parents' house. Like you said, they want to know it all, be it all. I'm the adult in the house right now. And I feel like we're lacking some specific skills in K to 12 to teach them critical thinking. Or like you said, what is an oppressor? What is genocide? How do you decipher what's propaganda and what's not? So when they get to college, they already have the skills and the tools to figure out not just who I am as a person with meaning and purpose and belonging, but what is wrong and what is right as well. Um, my other thought with that was, back to your points before about the evidence about the Muslim Brotherhood and how this was planned since the 90s. How do you connect that to anti-Semitism and what we're seeing right now on college campuses? Kind of like that intersection with the campus radicalization and anti-Semitism.
So, there is definitely a connection. I mean, I think if you even go back to the 2010s, right? Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood aligned groups, they really began at that time perfecting their model of adopting other causes and merging their cause with the others, attempting to create bonds with groups who would not otherwise support terror, but who also maybe had anti-US, anti-democratic, and importantly anti-Semitic views to kind of build their alliances. And like there was one example of, I think, let's talk about the groups. So some of the groups that are driving this activity with an agenda are the American Muslims for Palestine and the Students for Justice in Palestine. Those two groups, not everyone that's involved in them. I'm not trying to articulate that everyone that's involved in a protest that SJP is leading is a supporter of Hamas, but the individuals behind those organizations and behind the agendas and what we're seeing on campus today, they absolutely know and are intentionally doing what they're doing. And, I'll give you an example, and this is before October 7th. So this is one of many, many examples. I think it was 2017 where, you had the SJP chapter at NYU, and there was an event where there were some police officers that shot and killed two African American males. SJP at NYU sees that, and on social media posted out that Black men were being lynched by police because the Israeli Defense Forces trained the police. And by taking the unfortunate death of two African American men and manipulating it and rolling it into their narrative and then spewing it out, they're able to then what? Bond with groups that otherwise would not support terror, but feel aligned with them because they have, kind of merged their causes.
Oh my gosh. I am besides myself. I mean, I think the part that's so overwhelming is that how long this has been happening.
Yes. Yes. It has been happening for quite some time, but it's been gradual. But we really saw it, right? The day after October 7th. I mean, this is even before Israel had a chance to even recover live bodies and victims, and certainly before they were able to retaliate against the terrorists who committed the attacks. We saw all of this extremely organized activity, and the activity was absolutely advocating for the terrorist attack. And, you know, openly on campus, undeterred. And that's what was getting the media coverage, and that was very organized and very well orchestrated by the groups that were behind it. And I don't know if you saw or not, but immediately even the Iranian regime leaders came out and praised the students for their work, claiming that they were exporting the Iranian Revolution to the United States. And there were students whom I'm certain have no idea what the Iranian regime is or the Iranian Revolution was, who are celebrating that and identifying with Iran when they don't realize that before the Iranian Revolution, women could walk down the street in a business suit and hold very important jobs. And that with the Iranian Revolution and the installation of the Islamist regime, the oppressive Islamist regime that is a state sponsor of terrorism, all of those women rights went away, right? But they don't
Yeah.
understand that. They're, oh, Iran is so proud of us. Long live Iran. Make sure you know what you're talking about before you hold up a sign and make a statement, right?
Oh my gosh, completely. I mean, I think about too the social media war. And, the social media war began really on October 7th. I'm like, it hasn't even arrived to this country, and people are celebrating on social media. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are of how social media platforms and just any online communities have been facilitating the spread of radical narratives among students.
So it certainly began even before October 7th. So let's go back. I mean, and I would argue that Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood are the experts at propaganda, but other terrorist groups likewise have used, media for a long time to advocate for, joining the terrorist groups, committing acts of terrorism. And clearly the way that they have been able to publish all of that information has evolved. And with the advent of social media, all of the terrorist groups have immediately, seized those platforms because they know that when they used to be able to reach 10 readers or 1,000 viewers, that they can literally tap into millions of people and send a 1-minute message that instills fear and rage and hate and anti-Semitism and promotes violence like that, and to millions of people. So social media has enabled this for good, or it has its good qualities. We're all thankful, for certain aspects of social media, but the terrorists have absolutely seized that as an opportunity to conduct mass radicalization. And again, when you're talking about the younger population, that's where they go to get their news. They don't go to printed media. They don't go to the local news channel. They look to see if it's true on social media.
Mhm.
And that's a scary proposition because anyone can have an Instagram channel, anyone can have a Telegram channel, anyone can have a Twitter account and then say things that aren't true. And if they're following it, then they're consuming it. And then you add in the algorithms, right? And so if they've accidentally stumbled upon one nefarious message, they'll be fed 100 like-minded messages. And then it appears to the consumer that that's the only message that's out there. It must be true. And so it's a very scary world that we live in with all of social media. And it is not limited to just, the terrorist use of social media platforms. It's child predators. It is, a whole host of predators out there victimizing people through use of social media. It's a scary thing.
I mean, it's echo chambers, right? Like, I mean, becoming those echo chambers for people to get recruited or be more vulnerable to those propagandas. It's scary.
Certainly. And then if you look at it, so let's go outside of the successful student faculty, population, and let's go to maybe your more isolated, alienated individuals in society. There are a lot of them who are disgruntled for one reason or another, whether they're, angry that they don't make enough money, or they're angry because they don't like their teachers at school, or they're angry because they didn't make the cheerleading team. And they're angry and they go on social media and they want validation for being angry, right? They want to not feel bad about themselves. And what these predators do is they tell them, well, you shouldn't feel bad about yourself. The emotions that you're having are righteous, right? And in fact, if you join us, we can give you a higher purpose. And so they take someone who feels they have no identity, or they're worthless, or their life is going nowhere. And they, through social media, convince them that if they do certain things, they can become heroes in society. They can be revered. And that is a powerful message, especially to young people who really don't have an identity yet, or feel like that they don't have a place in the world, to be told you can become someone that everyone will know. And that, again, that's a scary aspect of it, because that message can be conveyed very quickly and to a lot of people. And we've seen that evolve, right, into terrorist acts in years past.
I mean, that's what we're seeing at my work at Parents for Peace. We see that there are a lot of times it's unresolved grievances or victimhood. And then you have someone who come and offer you a sense of belonging and purpose, like you mentioned. And it's interesting to me from my trauma lens of, when I try to do the same thing with trauma survivors, I try to give them meaning and purpose. And if they're able to shift from victimhood to, it's almost like a choice point, right? Like if I'm feeling like a victim right now, or if I'm suffering and I'm looking for validation, looking a sense of belonging, if I'm on that right path and someone is reaching out with the right message, with the right purpose, with the right sense of belonging, that can lead to post-traumatic growth. But if I'm over here and vulnerable, then I can be recruited by extremists, which makes me think about what can we do, what message can we give parents or society, communities about preventing this?
I think we need to tell parents and communities and schools and teachers and counselors that they need to be present and involved. We need, in society, need to be paying attention to what our children and our students and our families are listening to, what they're watching, what they're saying, who they're hanging out with. I mean, back when I was growing up, we didn't have social media, but my parents were very concerned about who I was on the phone with or who I was going to a party with. And why is that? Because, you can be unduly influenced by individuals in your life. And I think that, nowadays, at least what I've observed, again, I have teenagers, is that a lot of people in society, they look at their youth and they're on their phones all the time. They've got their doors closed, they're in their rooms, they're on their computers at night, and there's no oversight. And, whether it's a lack of interest, or, they feel like they're invading their privacy, or they feel like, that they're old enough to make their own decisions. All of that is helping lead to this. We need to be present for our children. We need to be involved in our communities. We need to have a voice. We need not to be afraid to say the truth. We need not to be afraid to make someone uncomfortable. We need not to be afraid to make our children mad by telling them they can't use that social media account because it's bad for their mental development. And but where does that start, right? I think education is the key, and education is to families and communities. Like, we need to understand the facts, but more importantly, we need to be present. We need to know what to look for. We need to ask questions. We need to be involved. Um, not to say that everyone needs to be a helicopter parent, but we need to be listening.
I love everything you're saying because I'm also thinking about the importance of connection. I mean, we're wired to be in relationships. And
Yes.
so if we are the outlier or if we're experiencing isolation, of course you want to belong, you want to be part of. And then my history um, is domestic violence. That was my personal history is domestic violence, and then I worked in domestic violence shelters. And what I found was fascinating was the intersection with domestic violence and cults. And it's just so easy to trust and to believe. And so then I go back to the students. Most of their brains have not been fully developed. They're looking for belonging, for connection. What would you say to parents and peers in terms of like the signs and behaviors to be looking for?
I mean, I think that there are a number of things that are indicators of not just potentially being exposed to radicalization, but other things. And that is, addiction to social media, the desire to be isolated. As you said, we're humans. We typically want to be connected. So if the children want to be isolated or the students want to be isolated in their dark room 12 hours a day, I mean, can you blow that off and say, oh, well, that's just a teenager? Well, you probably need to rethink that, because they're not just in there in the dark sleeping. Typically, they're consuming some sort of messaging from social media. So I would say isolation is something, addiction to social media, where that they feel like they have to have it. It's like a drug. It's like a drug. Expressions of anger, expressions of hate towards people, expressions of intolerance, like all of those things should evoke questions from parents. Like, well, why do you feel that way about that particular group of people? Like, why do you feel like, and asking those questions. And does that mean that you're going to be able to change a young person's mind? No, but by asking the question, sometimes you can provoke, intelligent thought and self reflection by those individuals. So I would say, those are signs to be looking for. And then certainly, it's the same thing as when we were growing up. You look at their associates, right? What are their associates doing? I mean, are their associates wearing swastikas? Well, that's probably a sign that you don't need to have your child be involved with that person, right? And then also, when we're talking about symbols, a lot of us don't know what a variety of symbols mean. But if our youth or members of our community or in our social circles are all of a sudden donning symbols that we don't understand, especially the young people, it begs the question of, well, are those symbols relevant? Is it just a fashion tag, or does that symbol mean something bigger and potentially more hazardous? And then again, asking those questions and being involved, listen, watch, be present.
You know what's interesting, Lara, about what you're saying? It makes me think about symbols, and I didn't know about a red triangle before, and what it meant, and how people are using symbols. I mean, it makes me think our college students know what are using the symbols, um, but that normalization of some either slogans or symbols as part of hate, right? Like we see the whole anti-Zionism and justification of that, and shirts with red triangle and a map of Israel with Palestinian flag, like or people in protest wearing like Hezbollah uniform, like everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And looking at all of that from those lens, I want to bring us back to what's happening right now in USA, not just like since October 7th or since the 90s. Do you
Mm-hmm.
think there's a link between what we're seeing on college campuses, everything you described before, and the recent event specifically against Jews? Like the murder
I
in
do.
Colorado, the murder in DC.
I do. And I've said this in so many formats that if anybody's listening to me that's listened to me before, they're probably tired of hearing me make this analogy. But I'm going to make it again because it's one that I feel like really represents what we're dealing with. So, we can all recognize acts of violence as lethal, as dangerous. The murder in DC, the attack on the innocent people in Colorado, we all know that those are bad in general in society, except those that are promoting, terrorist acts. that violence is bad. Well, I equate that, if you're looking at the problem, let's think about if you're at the beach and your children are in the water and there's a shark and you see a dorsal fin. Pretty much everyone on the beach sees that dorsal fin and recognizes that the dorsal fin is a sign of danger. Get out of the water. But where does the real danger lie? It's not the fin. It's the heart. It's the blood. It is that powerful driving force that's under the water. That's where the danger is. And so when you look at terroristic propaganda and rhetoric and terroristic acts in general, I think that's what we're looking at. The fin are the violent acts. The beast is the radicalization. And so with every thread and publication of a normalized narrative that it is okay to hate Jewish people, and it is acceptable and in fact necessary to kill them to please your God or to accomplish a political or ideological goal. When that rhetoric becomes so normalized, we are absolutely going to see things like we saw in Washington, D.C. a little over a week ago, and what we see in Colorado, because those individuals are consuming that narrative and believe, yes, this group of people should be hated. This group of people, we should take acts of violence against them. That is the right thing to do. And the wider and broader that message is spread, the more dangerous that message is. And the more danger, or the more likely it is that acts of violence will then take place.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So it's so overwhelming. So as I'm on a campus and I'm witnessing it, not just on, our campus necessarily, but on, UCLA and Columbia, and we're constantly seeing this. What role do you feel that foreign terrorist organizations or extremist influencers are playing in shaping student movements or protests under the guise of activism?
I mean, I think it's happening. I think it's happening everywhere, and that's it goes right back to the group of Hamas, the U.S. based Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood infrastructure plan decades ago is, we want to teach people to hate the Jewish people. We want to teach people to oppose peace with the Jewish people. We want to teach people that jihad, that violence is the way, and we're going to package it in a way that's appealing to others. And so, yes, it is couched as activism. It is couched as, civil rights movements. It is couched as advocacy for, anti-apartheid, anti-genocide, all of those things. And that's exactly, what's happening is you've got student activists who want to do the right thing merging into, these groups where they don't realize that there are bad actors behind them, driving them, in a way that they really don't want to go or never would have gone. You can be a social activist. You can be opposed to oppression and be opposed to genocide and be opposed to, a variety of things. But in our society, what should not be acceptable is hate of people because of where they're from, who they worship, how they worship, what they look like. And then it should not be acceptable for people to advocate for violence against those people because of that. That's not what our society is about, but that's what these bad actors are trying to drive. And so we need all of those wonderful social activists out there who want to do good to take a step back and understand exactly what it is that they're promoting, and to maybe back up and approach the problem set with dialogue in a way that is in favor of love, not hate. And I posted this on my social media yesterday, but I was reminded yesterday of a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that has always meant a lot to me. And I think it is so relevant today. And that is, you can't drive out darkness with darkness. Only light can do that. You can't drive out hate with hate. Only love can do that. So all of these wonderful students and activists that want the world to be a better place have them step back and realize that supporting acts of murder and violence against anyone cannot be the answer.
I love what you're saying right now because it reminds me that, a lot of the social justice movement right now are excluding Jews
Mhm.
under Zionism. And when a social justice is doing it, they're not just, right? There's no, it's if you're excluding a group, then how are you part of social justice, basically?
It's an excellent point, but it's part of the dehumanization, right? I mean, that's part of the anti-Semitic agenda, is dehumanizing Jewish people, because a social activist certainly wouldn't exclude any person because of your religion or ethnicity or anything else like that, because that, exactly as you said, goes against social justice. But the rhetoric involves the dehumanization of the Jewish people. And by doing that, they're, very slowly attempting to set the Jewish people apart from social activism by dehumanizing them, which is abhorrent, right? That is not who we are as a country. We don't do that. And so again, I think there are a large section of the population that are advocating for things they don't really understand, and that they need to just stop and back up, inform themselves. And you can continue being an activist if you're opposed to war, if you want peace, but making sure that you're not aligning yourself with causes that are in fact not for the public good, and in fact racist and murderous.
So how can Jewish and their allies, if I hope we have allies, what can they do to prepare right now as a community?
I think education is the key. I really do. I mean, I think that education is the key, because I can't tell you how many groups that I've spoken to since I joined the program on extremism, educating, willing audiences. These are audiences that are not, they don't have an agenda. They just want to understand the truth. And how many of them had no idea before receiving the education with the actual documents and the wiretaps and all of this kind of stuff? How many had no idea what was happening? And that is not just in law enforcement communities. I'm talking about in Jewish communities, right? So education is key, because we can't, as a society, solve a problem if we don't know where the root of it is. And the root of it is in evil places. And so we have to educate people to understand. And then once they have the information, then they can make a decision, an informed decision about the path that they want to choose. But it has to begin with education, and it has to also, involve people not being afraid to use their voices. And this is something that I think is also a problem that we're dealing with today, in that, a large number of people in our society who don't feel impacted by this issue. Well, one, that's ignorance, because it's not just an anti-Semitism issue. It's an anti-democracy issue. And it's anti-West issue. But a lot of people do not want, even if they do understand the facts, are not raising their voice when they should, for a number of reasons. But it's primarily fear. It's fear of being labeled an Islamophobe, or fear of being labeled a racist, or fear of losing their job, or fear of their companies being boycotted. Fear that is being driven by these individuals who don't want the truth to see the light of day. And, I think it is important that we encourage everyone. It is time to be brave. It is time to be brave. We need, all of us in society, to do the right thing for the right reason in the right way. And staying silent in today's society with all that is going on is not the right thing to do. And you mentioned, just not that this is relevant. I am not Jewish myself, but I often am asked, why I have such a passion for countering extremism and countering terrorism. And it wasn't because I grew up in any sort of situation where I was traumatized. I did not have a background in, Middle East conflict, but I very simply grew up in a small town. And my father and mother were they're very strict parents. We were, raised in a religious household, But my dad was an extremely humble person who preached that in everything that he did, not necessarily everything that he said. He led by example. You do the right thing for the right reason, the right way, and the right thing is often not the easy thing. And, I grew up under that, and my dad has since passed away, but I had carried that message with me. Is it easy doing this? Is it easy? Or no, it's not easy, but it's the right thing. And I think more people in our society today need to think about that. Like, am I doing the right thing for the right reason and the right way? And if not, how can I do better?
Oh my gosh, Laura, I could like ugly cry just hearing your dad and then hearing your dad coming through you. Yes, it's interesting because in my personal life, either there was pushback, like very strong pushback, or there was silence. And, the silence seems to be taking a stand in terms of being a bystander. I mean, we saw what happened with the bystanders in 1933. I mean, we saw what was happening and that they didn't think what happened could potentially happen. So I'm wondering for you, you give me hope. I mean, just hearing your dad through you, like, just gave me hope. And I'm wondering, how do you keep hope alive in this work?
Yeah, well, frankly, I think it's talking to people like you. I mean, I every day encounter really amazing people who are resilient and strong and want to do the right thing and are willing to sacrifice, themselves and their lives and the time with their children to make society better. And that gives me hope because I know there are people out there and every day we see them. And, if you look at some of the families and the survivors of the terrible October 7th terror attack and the resilience that they have, it's inspiring because, I think maybe a lot of people don't even realize, and I don't want to get into the whole Israeli Hamas conflict per se, but how much death the citizens of Israel have suffered over decades at the hands of terror organizations and how they continue to be resilient and have hope and proceed through life and contribute to society. And I think that really it's an example of what we all can do in life is that we can do this together.
We have to do this together. I mean, I
Yeah.
think this is, as an Israeli, I can tell this is one of the strengths of Israel is that we try to come together as people because we do believe that somehow we're all connected. We're all one big piece of fabric that is tissue that is connected, and we need to lift each other up. Um, and I so cherish your voice. I think you, like Susie said, you give me hope, but you also give me courage that people like you fight and stand up and not stand by against hate and against and doing what's right, basically. So we have two last questions that we ask everybody. What was it like to tell your story today?
Do you say what was it like to tell my story?
Yeah.
I feel empowered every time I'm able to talk about this with people who want to listen and understand. And so I would say, very empowering, very empowering.
And our last question is, what will you do for your own healing this week?
That is a great question. Go for a walk.
Mm.
I think best when I'm walking. That is my meditation. Some people like to, meditate or go to yoga and things like that. But in reality, my mind works best. No music, no sound, walking outside in nature. It doesn't matter to me how hot it is. It is, just breathing in fresh air and letting my mind kind of process through problem sets and things like that. So I'm going to take a walk.
I love that. I'm so appreciative of your higher brain, your heartbeat. I mean, everything about you. Yeah, I feel so honored. And what a beautiful way to end this season with your compassion and your knowledge and your wisdom and your hope. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you all. This has been the brightest spot of my Friday. So thank you very much.
Call for action, Susie, for our listeners, based on what Lara was telling us. Go out and educate yourself. We didn't have this information, and if I take something from this conversation, is education is key. So thank you again, Lara.
Thank you so much. It was lovely talking to you all.